A little over 2 years ago, our research team went coast to coast, 5 different regions, and we interviewed leaders of what we'll call self-defined flourishing congregations, and I'll explain that in a moment, okay? What do we mean by flourishing? What is a flourishing congregation? We went around the country. We interviewed over 100 leaders from Catholic, mainline, conservative Protestant contexts who were either in denominational or pastoral leadership. And we asked them this question: when you think of a flourishing congregation, what comes to mind? What are the central perceptions and definitions that constitute a flourishing congregation? Now, no doubt, we could stop right now, we could go right around this room and try to answer this question. We get a lot of different responses to that question. We can save you that work because we've gone coast to coast and done this. Here are 3 things we found out. It's not actually the purpose of what I want to talk about today, but it gives you the background context for the survey that we are going to center our time and attention on. First, there was a sharp divide between those who believe that flourishing entails numeric growth and those who do not. Okay? There are some who we met with who said a flourishing congregation is one that is growing numerically. And as much as we heard those narratives, we heard this conception from many that says actually numbers have little, if anything, to do with flourishing. Another way of putting it is that our congregation can be flourishing without growing numerically. Okay, I'm not here to define for you where you should land on that continuum, other than to simply lay it out on the table and say that there is a range of perceptions on the link between flourishing and numbers. Second thing we learned is that depending on the Christian tradition in question, there are several partially overlapping and conflicting pictures of what constitutes a flourishing congregation. I'll show you an image in a moment. You have it in your welcome folders as well, of how different groups are defining and thinking about a flourishing congregation. And third, supernatural discourse figures into how leaders discuss flourishing congregations over and against secular or human-controlled narratives. What I mean by that is simply this. Many who we interviewed, we asked about what is a flourishing congregation, how do you explain your own context? They said, we have flourished because of the work of the Holy Spirit. In other words, we have flourished not because of things that we have done. We have flourished because of a supernatural agent, if you will, that has contributed to, caused, directed the flourishing that has happened within our own context. That is the background narrative that we bring to this survey. We just, a couple weeks ago, we didn't just write it 2 weeks ago, it officially came out 2 weeks ago, published an article that summarizes the 3 things I've just talked about. It's freely available online. I've provided the title there, What is a Flourishing Congregation? Leader perceptions, definitions, and experiences. We're going to feature this in our forthcoming newsletter, so if you haven't subscribed to our newsletter, you can do so on our website. We'll provide the article there, our social media channels, our website, etc., so you can read more details about that particular set of findings. But those things put in motion and set the context for the national survey that we're in the middle of. We're in the middle of this national congregational survey. We're testing a number of elements from the things that we learned in phase 1 of our research, but now we're doing so with attenders as well as leaders. It's primarily congregants, those who are sitting in your pews. How do they think about the world? How do they think about faith and spirituality in your congregation? I'll share a little bit about method. I know this might be the boring stuff for many of you, but we have to do our due process, if you will, and address these kinds of questions, really important to help explain how we've arrived at the data we've arrived at so far. So we reached out to over 500 congregational and denominational leaders from Catholic, mainline, and conservative Protestant settings, inviting their congregations to be part of this survey. We then encouraged those individuals to refer us to other congregations who may have an interest in participating in this survey. I want to say this, and I can't stress this enough. This survey has been and continues to be open to any congregation of any size, of any denomination, of any region across this country. You don't need to be large. You don't need to see yourself as flourishing or not. Wherever you see yourselves as a congregation, this survey has been and continues to be open right across the spectrum, regardless of size. If this is something that you want to plug into as you hear some of the data today and you want to know more about this in the context of your congregation, one of the things we're committing as an institute is to provide you with a congregation-specific report, such that Your congregation gets involved. We'll produce a report. We have a sample report to my left here at this table. And you can flip through what the report would look like. You would receive a report like that, but specific to your own congregation. So if these are things that interest you, we encourage you to jump aboard, to sign up at the table with Loren at the lunch break or the afternoon break, and we'd be delighted to draw you further into this national survey. What I want to do over the next 45 minutes or so is share what we've learned to date from this survey. We've had, as of this data, this is 11 days old. I'm going to give you live, real-time data. 11 days old. We had just under 2,000. As of this morning, we were approaching 2,200, so we're a little out of date. Forgive me. You'll get the general themes that have emerged from the data so far. 77 congregations. I'm going to draw on data from 77 congregations to date. A few demographic pieces of information, and the reason I share these things is both to locate who we're hearing from, but perhaps as importantly, who we're not hearing from in the data. And we have to hold those things in mind as we are processing the different questions that we'll hear today. So, 42% of the congregations so far have fewer than 100 weekly attenders. You may or may not know this, but most congregations in Canada have fewer than 100 weekly attenders. This is actually the norm right across the country. We tend to hear of the exceptions, but most have fewer than 100. In our sample, just over 10% have 500 weekly attenders or more. In terms of denominations represented, I've just listed the top three, and I'll mention the fourth in a moment there, but Christian and Missionary Alliance, 23% of our sample, Reformed, includes Christian Reformed, and so forth, 19.9%, and United Church of Canada at 13.4% of our sample thus far. Catholic, 7.9% of the sample, is sixth of the denominations within our sample thus far. Really important player and really important comparison point as we're thinking about that visual we had earlier on today, 40% of the Canadian population. So this is obviously a group among others that we're working hard to grow that part of the survey sample. Largest three provinces represented in the survey thus far include Ontario, Alberta, and Saskatchewan. And three final demographic pieces that may be of interest. This is an older sample of those who have participated so far. 67% of those who filled out the survey are age 50 years or older. We're dealing mostly with smaller locations. 62% of our samples so far come from towns, cities of 250,000 or fewer. This is significant, important. I think one of the first pieces of feedback we received when we started our project is help us understand the rural church. And I think we actually have lots of really good data so far on rural congregations, and we'll share some of those things today. And then finally, established churches. 81% of congregations who have been involved in our study so far have been around for 30 years or longer. So this helps to paint a bit of the picture, the background of groups that are represented, but importantly, the groups that are not represented. We are actively recruiting when we're moving into January, where we are recruiting congregations whose voices you don't hear in these statistics. So if you're looking to include your congregation, your denomination, we'd love to include and broaden that in our sample moving forward. All right. I don't know if you can see that. You'll have a visual in your folder as well, if that helps to see this. We provided a sample report where you can see these things. But this is what we're calling the Flourishing Congregations construct. These are the different ways in which leaders across the theological spectrum, when we ask them what defines a flourishing congregation, here are the things that came to mind. There was a series of things related to organizational ethos on self-identity, leadership, innovation, and structure and process. Super important things. We're not going to talk about that today in the context of our data and our time. Second, there were a whole range of things related to internal factors and variables, things related to discipleship, engaged laity, hospitable community, and diversity. We're not going to talk about those things today either. We are, however, going to focus on the third aspect of this construct, on those things related to the outward dimension, on partnerships, on evangelism, and on, there you go, neighborhood involvement will be the three that we will center our time on over the next 45 minutes or so. So, I referenced in our interviews and focus groups that there was this strong debate on the link between numbers and flourishing. And so we wanted to ask that question on the survey, and we wanted to link the perception of flourishing with the perception of growth. So here are two questions that we asked on the survey, and then we brought it together in this visual that you see here. The first question we asked was, generally your congregation is flourishing, and we're asking for level of agreement. We're not defining what flourishing means. We're asking for those who are attending for their own self-assessment. We asked them a second question about, to the best of your knowledge, average weekly attendance is growing, staying the same, or declining. So we are dealing with perceptions here, and we know that there are flaws with that, okay? If you want to get actual numbers, you either need to go to individual congregations and get all the records to track these things, really important, very difficult to do with this kind of task. Or you go and you physically sit in everyone's congregations and you count week by week, so you can all feel what it's like to be a researcher. So this is not the best or only barometer of whether churches are growing or declining, but I think it does give us a fairly general sense of people's perceptions of these things and then linking these things together. So what you see behind me here is this comparison of those who believe their congregations are growing on the far left-hand side. In the middle, those who believe they're staying the same, and those who believe their congregations are declining on the right-hand side. Generally, your congregation is flourishing. How do we read this data? What you see on the far left-hand side, the agree and the strongly agree, the red and the lighter brown color there, that there tends to be a link in people's perceptions anyways, that as they are growing, they're flourishing. And when congregations are not growing, when they are declining, there is this perception by many that their congregation is not flourishing. Again, we're not here as a research team to resolve that for you, to say, well, you are or you're not flourishing, simply to present people's perceptions from the pews, how they see these things. However, there is an important asterisk that should be drawn here, and it is in the top right-hand corner, that you have almost 20% of those in declining congregations who believe that their congregation is flourishing. And this, I think, leads our team to a very important insight, something that anchors some of the work that we do in this research project, and it is this: that congregations, regardless of growing or declining, have some aspects or areas of flourishing within them. We are not talking about congregations that are unilaterally flourishing in every single area, nor are we talking about congregations that are not flourishing in each and every way. And I think when those who are sitting in the pews, regardless of growth or decline, are seeing some signs of flourishing within those contexts. So, to summarize, in general, those who are part of growing congregations tend to be more likely to say that they are flourishing. However, there is this 1 in 5 of those within declining contexts who still see their congregations as flourishing. There is this range, if you will, in how individuals are thinking about and perhaps talking about, and we'll see that in some of the data to come forward here. So, neighborhood involvement. One of the clearest indicators we heard from our interviews a couple of years ago in focus groups was this theological belief and commitment that if your congregation was not actively involved in the neighborhood, you could not be flourishing. Would our community notice if our church was no longer here? Was a question that many posed to us across this country as a barometer for a measurement, if you will, of neighborhood involvement. So we wanted to test those things out and ask a number of questions. Here's some of the things that we discovered. First, we wanted to know, how close do people live to their congregation? Especially when you compare this between different size cities, towns, or rural districts. Depending on the size of the community, a fairly small proportion of attenders live within 1 kilometer of their church. This is slightly higher on the far left-hand side in communities that have fewer than 50,000 people who live there. However, close to 50% of people live inside of a 5-kilometer radius of their congregation. I must say this was a bit surprising to me and to our research team, to see 50% living within a 5-kilometer radius of their congregation, especially when you hear lots about, particularly in urban centers, of people driving long distances, find the church that meets your needs, and you'll drive 20 kilometers to get to that church. This is certainly there. And we see that within the data. But I think for us, part of the takeaway is that 50% are living within 5 kilometers of their congregation. One final thing I will say about this data. In communities with fewer than 50,000 residents, so on the far left-hand side, congregants are also traveling longer distances to their faith communities. Here we're talking about some of the rural congregations across the country, where 18% are traveling between 10 to 20 kilometers, and an additional 15% are traveling more than 20 kilometers. In other words, in some of the rural populations, you have individuals who are living really close to the congregation, but you also have some who are traveling from farther distances. What does that mean for local church life based on where your members live relative to some of the neighborhood impact and conversations, etc.? Hopefully this contributes some of the data to kind of specify the geographical range of people within their church settings. This is, I should give you like a survey warning. This is going to be information overload. You're going to see a lot of numbers, a lot of charts. Don't get bogged down with everything. Jot down a few things that stand out to you. Pay attention to the large pictures, and we'll try to make sense of these things along the way. At the end of the survey, we asked participants about their level of agreement with this statement. A flourishing parish or congregation is involved in its neighborhood and community. Here you see a comparison, and we're going to do this throughout much of the data today, between congregations that are growing, staying the same, or declining based on people's perceptions to give us a fairly helpful comparison across these three groups. What we see here is that although there's generally a high level of agreement across congregational contexts, that a flourishing congregation is involved in its neighborhood and community, there is a higher level of strong agreement among congregations believed to be growing versus declining. There's a higher level of agreement among congregations believed to be growing versus declining. This is going to be a recurring theme that we will see in this particular section on neighborhood involvement. Is there something different about the ways in which we think about our role in the congregation and in the neighborhood, and how might that translate or connect with what we're doing on the ground, okay? All right, I'm going to take a time out, because here's what we want to do. We want to engage you right now, live on the spot, a live survey and poll, okay? So if you have your smartphones, if you have your computer, if you have your iPad, we're going to try this. It may not work. We've tested it beforehand, but we're going to give it a try. I want you to answer for us. There's no right or wrong answers. Everything's confidential. We're not going to find out who's answering what. We want to hear from you how you would answer this question in your own context. To what extent do you disagree or agree with the following statement? Your parish or congregation has an active presence in the wider community. Now, to access this, go to menti.com, menti.com. There's a code for you there. You enter that when you get to the website. And we'll have you answer that question. And then we'll compare with what you share here with what we hear from the survey, which we'll go to on the next slide. So I'll give you a minute. As you answer, as you can think about that, not surprising to our research team, if you can't access, it's free Wi-Fi, thank you, Ambrose Guest, you can access that, or you can just turn your data on for the 60 seconds, fill out, probably help our Wi-Fi connection as well all the way around the room. One of the things as we were working through the survey, and going through some of the data, we asked respondents of to what extent do you agree or disagree with these different marks or traits of flourishing. And as you might expect, people generally say, oh yeah, these are important things and signs of flourishing. And does this mean that as researchers, we've now kind of put this in your head before you answered it, and therefore we should answer this is the right and correct way? I suppose there's an element of that that could be certainly in play, but as we parse out some of the data, you'll see how this spreads itself out. All right. 80% here agree or strongly agree that your congregation has an active presence in your community around. We're going to move from this, and we're going to show you the data from the survey, and we'll see what we found from those within our sample. All right. Here we ask the question, our church has an active presence in the neighborhood. Generally, a positive perception that congregations have an active presence in their wider community. And, as we've noted before, more so in congregations where attenders believe they are growing versus declining. Okay? Now, it is one thing to ask about a congregation. Now let's ask about individuals. To what extent are you, as an individual, regularly part of congregational activities that reach out to the wider community? We begin to see the numbers go down fairly significantly. In other words, individuals see their congregations as a unit actively involved within the community, but when it comes to individuals who are actively involved in those very initiatives, we see lower levels of personal involvement compared to perceptions of congregational involvement. And yet at the same time, we see higher levels of personal involvement among those in growing congregations. Earlier, I referenced that question of would your neighborhood notice if your parish or your congregation was no longer here? Here's what respondents said to us. Overwhelmingly, again, a general positive self-perception of the place that the congregation in the immediate neighborhood plays around their church building. And again, the perception is stronger in congregations believed to be growing versus declining. Now, here's the really interesting thing for our research team. It's not surprising that many congregations would say the neighborhood would notice if we were no longer here, right? The real interesting question for us is what if we talk to those neighbors? And this is what we want to do in our next phase of research. When we do in-depth case studies with select congregations, we want to go around and talk to neighbors. And we want to talk to the surrounding communities and businesses. How do you think they might answer this question? The reason we highlight these things is because it's one thing to have congregational perceptions, and we're not diminishing these in any way, shape, or form, but it's one thing to have congregational perceptions, but what can we learn from those who you're supposedly evaluating would miss your presence? So we want to enter into that foray. Nevertheless, we have fairly positive perceptions of ourselves that our neighborhood would notice if we were no longer present in this community. We asked congregations about the various groups that they are interacting with and engaging within their surrounding community. We asked them to identify the 3 most prominent groups with whom your parish or congregation actively engages within the wider community. The data that you see here captures the 5 most cited areas across the board, across the country, within people's top 3 selections, right? So they're given a list of 20 different options or so. Just pick the top 3. These are the 5 out of that whole list of 20 that were mentioned more often than others. So you see kids and families, immigrants, refugees, seniors, poor, and students. These 5 demographic areas and groups. And of course, these areas do and will vary based on local context for different congregations, right? Whether you're in urban or suburban or rural context, these kinds of things matter for the kinds of groups that congregations are engaging. But it gives us a bit of a quick barometer of the kinds of groups that congregations are interfacing with in their surrounding community. So, to summarize, when it comes to neighborhood involvement, people generally hold positive perceptions about their congregation's role in the community. And these perceptions are more positively held where people believe that their church is growing. However, there are lower levels of personal involvement in those actual activities, and I think this is an important distinction to make. From our research so far in the survey, from our reading elsewhere, there are a few practical insights that might be helpful as you entertain in your own congregational setting questions about neighborhood involvement. I think we heard some great things on the panel this morning, right? Studying your neighborhood. Who lives in your neighborhood? What's the demographic composition? What are the strengths and weaknesses of the different organizations that reside within that neighborhood that your congregation is involved in? So toward that end, perhaps just some helpful things. Consider hosting a roundtable. A roundtable whereby you invite people to the table who live within that neighborhood and community, other businesses, organizations, etc., and get people talking about what are the strengths and assets of this community. How can we partner with those who are in this community? Where are the gaps? What are the strengths of our congregation, and how might we come alongside those who are within our neighborhood? So studying the neighborhood, being aware of who lives in your neighborhood might be a helpful thing. Second, it's important that church leadership embraces the need to have an active presence in the community. This is something that needs to be modeled from the front and from the top. And it needs to be embraced and talked about and demonstrated and practiced among those in leadership. It doesn't mean it inevitably will flow down through the congregation, but it's very difficult for congregations to have a neighborhood presence or involvement whereby it grows up from the bottom up but isn't embraced among those who are in leadership in terms of our resources and so forth. Third, group narrative on the importance of being actively involved in the neighborhood. These things matter. So you heard this morning again on the panel of the ways in which the core values of a congregation are repeatedly referenced in the context of group gatherings. If neighborhood involvement is important to your congregation, in what spaces and places is it discussed and talked about in your liturgy and in your group gatherings? Fourth, embedding stories in your church liturgy. Feature neighborhood involvement opportunities within your liturgy. Talk about ways with which people can get involved. Share stories. One of the premise for our gathering today was to hear some stories, and we're going to hear some more this afternoon. Share stories of neighborhood impact in and through the ministry of your local congregation. This both alerts people who are in the pews to what is taking place in your congregation. It highlights why this is important, right? It highlights by talking about it, this is important to our group, and we believe that as a community of faith in this particular church, we ought to take these things seriously. Think and act creatively relative to the demographics and needs in your community. I think one of the greatest challenges and limitations in congregational settings is we like to copy and replicate what we hear in other settings. This is not our purpose or intention as an institute. It's not our purpose for gathering today, that you would say, oh, I heard this great idea, now I'm going to do that exact same thing in my church. That might be helpful, it might be, but we all minister in different contexts and in different locations. So think and act creatively relative to the needs of that particular community and neighborhood that you find yourself in, and take risks and try new things. And exploring partnerships with others in that community. We heard about that again on the panel this morning. We'll look at some of the data on partnerships momentarily, but explore partnerships whereby you can strengthen the impact within your neighborhood community. All right, that is neighborhood impact. Second, evangelism. This second dimension in the outward domain, we heard of across the board, frankly, in our phase 1 research. As you might expect, it was particularly stressed within conservative Protestant contexts. Many Catholics also talked about this, and lesser so within mainline Protestant traditions, though we did hear some discussion of evangelism within these settings as well. What did we learn about evangelism from our survey? Okay, again, at the end of the survey, we asked respondents about their level of agreement or disagreement that, quote, a flourishing parish or congregation practices evangelism. Here you see the comparison between growing, staying the same, and declining congregations. And although there is generally a high level of agreement across congregational contexts, there is a higher level of strong agreement among congregations believed to be growing versus declining. In fact, on no other indicator in the entire survey did we see as much of a spread as we see here between growing and declining congregations on the kinds of questions we're going to look at relative to evangelism here. Give you a moment to look at that. Okay, if you have your phones, we'll take that out again. We'll do one more live poll at menti, menti.com. You have your code at the top. To what extent would you say that your parish or congregation gives priority or not to engaging in evangelism? All right, you can keep answering. Almost 50% say moderate priority, high priority, or essential priority. If we were to partial out the highest two brackets, the essential and high priority, about 20% would say they give a high priority to evangelism within their congregational setting. And 40% say low priority or not a priority. What did we learn from our survey, and how does this compare between congregations where they believe they are growing and those who believe they are declining? We'll slide over to the other slide. Our congregation prioritizes evangelism. 40% in growing congregations give a high or essential priority to evangelism within their setting. 16% in those staying the same who give a high or essential priority, and in declining congregations, 11.6% give a high or essential priority to evangelism. We will see as we go through different pieces of data here that this is one of the biggest differences between growing and declining on the emphasis and priority they give to evangelism. How frequently do you verbally share your faith with others? Slightly higher rates of verbally sharing your faith weekly or more among growing congregations versus declining congregations. However, there are higher rates of never sharing your faith among declining congregations versus those who are growing. Never, the bottom, the right, you see declining, and weekly in the green, and daily, the top orange there. So those who are verbally sharing their faith seems to be happening more frequently in growing congregations versus declining. Now we ask, how often do you show your faith to others? You're going to see a significant difference here. Growing, staying the same, and declining, pretty much a wash in terms of differences. It seems that there's a high rate of people who are showing their faith to others, a significant difference from what we saw on the previous slide from those who are verbally sharing their faith with others. I'll just make a side sociological point here, an observation of why the potential difference, and I'll just go back and forth between verbally sharing your faith and showing your faith. I think there's something about I don't think it's distinct to Canadian society, but there is something about this aversion to we don't want to offend other people, right? It's very much in our DNA that we don't want to come across as exclusive, intolerant, and so forth, and evangelism has the potential to come across that way when we verbally share our faith, and for some, it can come across as, well, this is the right way to think about the world, and this is the wrong way of thinking about the world. These are some of the people's perceptions. And so this is how we generally approach evangelism in Canada, is that, I think this data bears it out. I'm going to be a nice person, right? And one day I hope you ask me why I'm a nice person. And then I'm going to tell you it's because I have Jesus in my heart. And then this serves as the gateway to verbally share your faith. Okay? Moment of confession. We're not going to do a live poll here. Just think inside. When's the last time someone asked you why you're a nice person? Okay? Never. So either we're not nice people, or, you see what I'm saying? I think there is this aversion to help explain some of the difference between verbally sharing our faith and showing our faith. There's other things that work there as well, but I think the social context matters for how we are thinking about these things. All right, how frequently do you invite non-Christians to your church? This is certainly not the end-all and be-all of evangelism, but it is one marker that gives us a bit of an indicator of how people are connecting their faith community with those outside their faith community. And sociologically is important because we know that the number one reason a person joins a religious group is because someone personally invites them to do so. So we're curious, what is at work here? There's a couple of ways to read the data here. First, most rarely or ever invite others to their church. Regardless of growing, staying the same, or declining. This is not a strong and active practice, if you will. Second potential takeaway from this data is that growing congregations are less likely to never invite people compared with congregations that are staying the same or declining. Put in another way, congregations who are staying the same or who are declining are more likely to never invite people, those who are sitting within their pews. We then asked respondents, what would you say are the 3 most effective strategies for evangelism in your church? This does not mean these actually are the most effective forms of evangelism. These are people's perceptions. I think this is important because if you're a church leader, you want to know how are those who are sitting in your pews perceiving the world, because this shapes behavior. This shapes how we actually operate within organizational life. So here we see children, family, youth ministries as perceived to be the number one strategy for evangelism. Women's ministries at a distant second. Small groups. Special occasions, by that we mean rites of passage, Christmas and Easter, weddings and funerals and so forth. And then fifth, Alpha. These are the 5 things that were singled out among a whole list of options to perceive to be the most effective strategies for evangelism in their church. We then asked individuals to identify what for you are the 3 biggest challenges in evangelism on a personal level. Lack of confidence, almost 48%. Fear of rejection, 31.5%. Increasing antagonism to Christian values and the Christian church, 30.8%. Few non-believers as friends, 28.6%. And lack of training at 19%. If I were a pastor, which I'm not, I'm a sociologist and I know my boundaries, but if I were a pastor and evangelism was important for me or my congregation, I would pay attention to these findings. And I would ask myself, how is it that I would engage members of my community to confront these challenges for the individuals who are sitting in my pews and what that means for evangelism within their sphere of influence? I don't have the answers for you. Maybe we'll hear some this afternoon and maybe some Q&A and discussion, some answers will emerge, but it would be a question I would ask as a church leader. All right, one final question I want to turn to. It's one thing to examine people's perceptions about evangelism in their church or to evaluate people's personal attitudes and activities. But what about those who are actually in the pews? Have they come to faith in and through that congregation? Have they transferred from another church? What is the source of those who are in the pews? We gave 5 options to those who are filling out the survey. We asked, of the following 5, which best describes you? Is this the first church you've ever attended? Did you used to attend regularly somewhere? Doesn't have to be this church, somewhere. You stopped attending for a period of time, and now you've returned to church, and it happens to be at this particular congregation. Did you transfer from another church in the city or town that you live in? Did you move from city A to city B, and you used to attend a church in your former city, and now you're looking for a church in the city that you've just moved to? And fifth, were you born and raised in this particular congregation? Here are the things that stand out to us, and this is not particularly surprising as we look at some of the other data within sociology of religion as well. That most who are in the pews are there because they have transferred in. They have transferred in either from another congregation within the city, or they have transferred in by way of, I've moved to the city and I'm looking for a church in that city. And depending on the context here, higher or lower rates of those who might have been born and raised within a specific congregation. But across the board, we're actually dealing with relatively few converts, so to speak. And by that I mean those for whom this is the first church they have ever attended, or if we were to broaden this definition, those for whom they used to attend regularly, stopped attending for a period of time, and have since returned. So in growing context, on the left-hand side there, if we were to combine those two groups of first church ever or I've returned, 16.6% might be identified as converts within that setting. Staying the same, 14.8%, and in declining congregations, 11.8% of converts. I'm going to say this sociologically, that many of the congregations that we look at that are growing tend to grow, not exclusively, but in many respects from transfer growth or in large part in urban centers where people are moving there from other centers who are plugged into a church. It's not the only thing. And you heard some of the stories this morning, right? And this is something we want to pay attention to as an institute, right? Where are congregations possibly growing where they're drawing in those who say they have no religion, for example, and what can we learn from such congregations for being effective in that way, and how can we share those insights in other settings? But we would say from the data we've seen so far and some other studies that the norm is that when we're talking about congregations that are growing, there is, you may be familiar with this phrase, the circulation of the saints. Right? Reginald Bibby talked about this, the circulation of the saints from one congregation to the next, and our data bears this out. So, to summarize on evangelism, notable differences between declining and growing contexts on the importance attached to evangelism, as well as people's actual behaviors. Though it is clear from what we're seeing so far that few across the board verbally share their faith with others. And we think this is partially reflected by who is in the pews. And we saw that on the previous slide. So some questions for consideration at a local level. How central would you say evangelism is to your congregation's life? How central is it to your teaching? Do you equip people for evangelism? You think about the slide of the barriers to evangelism for individuals personally. To what extent are we equipping people within our congregations? What are the opportunities that we are providing for others within this vein? So Alpha was a program that we heard of consistently across the country, across theological traditions. Are there opportunities for your congregation to plug into these networks? Celebrations. Do you celebrate when someone comes to faith in and through your congregation? You know, sharing stories, particularly of those who convert to the faith, has a powerful role and impact, not just for the convert, but for those who are in the congregation. Both to remind us that this might be an important element of congregational life, but it also reminds us that actually this is part of the shared vision of this particular congregational setting. And finally, and perhaps most difficult sometimes, is do you measure or track evangelism within your congregation? And we could insert the word evangelism with any other metric. Right? This is part of what we're trying to do as an institute. For the things that you believe are important, how do you know if you are accomplishing those things? Jeremy talked about being crystal clear on what your specific task is. How do you know if you're accomplishing that task? What are the things that you're measuring and paying attention to? Might be some questions to consider in your setting. All right, third and finally, in the shortest section of these, partnerships. This was something we didn't necessarily anticipate when we started out for interviews and focus groups, but leaders talked about partnerships as an integral element to their flourishing. And they shared of various partnerships that they had with other congregations in their own denomination. They shared of partnerships with other congregations from other denominations. They shared of partnerships with other religious groups. And they shared of partnerships with other agencies within the community, secular, religious, and so forth. And so we wanted to tease out some of these questions. All right, so at the end of the survey, again, we asked respondents to indicate their level of agreement or disagreement with the perceived importance of partnerships in a flourishing congregation. Here you see, again, a high level of agreement. And we're not comparing here, I'll say, between growing and declining, because we saw virtually no difference between growing and declining congregations on partnerships. There was the general themes and directions that you'll see here was fairly common and constant across these three groups. So here you see a high level of endorsement for partnerships. We did not specify for them what kinds of partnerships, and we did not specify the frequency of partnerships. So it could be everything from we meet once a year on Good Friday, for example, with other denominations or other congregations, or it could be we partner every week with all these different kinds of groups. We don't measure that in this particular question, just getting a general sense of their level of agreement or not that partnerships are important. We asked participants about their level of agreement that your parish or congregation allows other organizations to use your church building. A strong level of endorsement here. Nearly 80% strongly endorse the idea that they think it's important that the church building is used by others and that partnerships be forged in and through the building space that congregations have. How important do you think it is that you partner with other congregations within your denomination? Again, strong endorsement for partnering with other congregations within one's denomination, around 81%. What about across denominations? You still see high levels of agreement with this, but the numbers are starting to slide. And what we know sociologically, and what we see in the data that we'll show here, is that we tend to feel more comfortable partnering with others who are like ourselves, however defined. And that as we move further out of the circle to those who are less like ourselves, we seem to be less comfortable. Sociologists talk about this as the homogeneous unit principle. We tend to gather with others who are more like ourselves, and we feel less comfortable moving in directions beyond that. How about partnering with other religious groups? Again, you see lower levels of agreement here than we saw relative to other traditions within Christianity, but out with the denomination. You see this progressive scale. Right? If I could just say this again, this is one of the reasons as an institute we believe so strongly in ecumenical work and in bringing different faith traditions together for a gathering like this and in the research that we're doing, because we know that there are different perceptions across the divide, and part of our role, we think, is to bring groups together to learn from one another, to see signs and elements of flourishing across the spectrum, and to share and leverage those stories. All right, important to partner with social service agencies. High levels of agreement that one's congregation should partner with social service agencies. We do actually parse some of these things out in the survey. We don't have time or space today to go through them of the different kinds of groups that congregations are partnering with, and we do have that kind of data, but presenting merely the perceptions among congregants on how important or not these things are for those who are sitting in the pews. And then last, we asked participants about their level of agreement with your parish or congregation partnering with Christian or Catholic schools. Very much split on this question. About 50% agree or strongly agree, with the other half either strongly disagreeing, or being neutral or unsure in response to that question. The reason we present perceptions is because as a church leader, if you're trying to engage your congregation, you need to know how are they thinking about these things, so that we can't take for granted, well, everyone just would be on side with my vision as a pastor or our leadership's vision that we should do these things. This gives us a little bit of a barometer of these areas. So to summarize, There is overarching endorsement that partnerships are good to pursue, with greater levels of comfort the closer to home other organizations are to one's own congregation and mission. A question for consideration as you think about your own congregational setting: are there opportunities for your church to partner with and to leverage the strengths of other groups to help you mutually achieve core vision and mission for your specific group existing? Again, I think we heard stories across the panelists this morning of ways in which local church is partnering with the specific needs of the specific organizations in the immediate community around them. Those will look differently for everyone in this room based on your local context. We're not here to say you should only partner or you should only pursue these kinds of groups or partnerships, but to ask the question, who is in our neighborhood and who might we partner with in ways that importantly help us to accomplish the vision and mission that we believe we are called to as a congregation. Not the congregation down the road, not the congregation across the city or across the country, but our specific congregation. And how might partnerships help us to leverage the strengths of our own faith community alongside the strengths and opportunities of other groups within the neighborhood? So there isn't this sense of reinventing the wheel, but leveraging the expertise that's in the neighborhood and in the room and so forth. All right, a lot of data. Drinking from a fire hose. This is the kind of data that we are interested in as an institute to give us a bit of an inkling of what is happening on this particular outward dimension. We have a whole bunch of other data, of course, that we'll release at different points, but we wanted to give you in the spirit of what we're talking about today, of shared stories across theological traditions, and with an orientation towards looking outward. What are people saying in the pews, and how are they thinking and behaving and otherwise within that sphere?